Thank you for joining us and welcome to today's webinar, Mold Prevention, Detection, and Response. I'm Gillian, Tipsy's Preservation Specialist, and I will be talking you through mold and heritage collections. Some of you might have met me on site visits or may have attended one of my workshops, but if not, hello, it's nice to meet you. And I see that people are noting which institution you're from down in the chat box, which is great. It's really nice to see where everyone's from. Okay, so we're just going to go ahead and get started here. So just a bit about DHPSNY before we get onto the topic at hand. DHPSNY is a 5-year initiative to deliver essential training and services to New York's collecting institutions. DHPSNY services include archival needs assessments, preservation and conservation surveys, guidance with strategic planning, and access to a variety of educational programs and workshops. DHPSNY is making these services available free of charge to New York-based organizations that collect, preserve, and make accessible historical records and library research materials, which is all of you. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Just a quick note. If you can't, you can go ahead and make a note in the chat box, and we'll make sure that the volume is where it should be. So DHPSNY is also a collaboration between 2 long-running New York programs, the New York State Archives Documentary Heritage Program and the New York State Library Conservation Preservation Program. It was established in 2016 by the New York State Education Department's Office of Cultural Education to ensure consistent and comprehensive services to the vast network of organizations that safeguard New York's records and make them accessible. Okay, so we are here today to talk about mold on heritage collections. It's a huge topic, as I'm sure a lot of you know, but we will try to touch on some of the big issues during today's webinar. If you're at all squeamish, and I have to admit that I personally am quite squeamish about this, this might not be the most pleasant topic, but it is very important. So today we're going to cover the following: mold origin and growth, what it is, where it comes from, and why we don't want it growing on our heritage collections. Mold prevention, how to keep it from occurring in the first place. Mold detection, how to determine if you have a mold problem, the extent of the problem, and whether the mold is active or inactive. Mold response, how to deal with a mold situation safely for both objects and people. And finally, when to get help, how and when to get experts such as mitigation firms and conservators involved, because that is an important thing to know. So we all know what mold is, of course. But it's worth taking a deeper look at where mold originates from, as well as the structure, life cycle, and reproductive cycle of mold. And I'm quite proud that I managed to find some mold in DHPSNY colors also, I have to say, the slide. Mold is everywhere at all times. We cannot completely eradicate it, nor would we want to. Mold is necessary for many of the environmental processes we take for granted, including the breakdown of dead animal and plant tissue and the release of nutrients needed to support living things. We also have many beneficial byproducts from mold, including penicillin and cheese. A quick fact, 1 cubic meter of outdoor air may contain 1 million spores. Inside a moldy building, it can actually be 10 times that number, so 10 million spores. Right now, at this very moment, both you and I are breathing in approximately 600,000 mold spores every hour. Yuck. Personally, I try very hard not to think about that. So how does mold get into our heritage collections in the first place? Well, it's always in the air, as we just talked about. Mold is also carried on dusty surfaces, in food, and on fresh flowers and plants, which is one reason why we usually recommend that food, plants, and flowers are kept out of collections areas. Sometimes an object has inherent vice. In this case, contamination has occurred during the object's production. So maybe mold spores got into the paper pulp vat, for example. An object may have been contaminated during use, for example, outdoor exposure, improper storage, etc. Mold can sometimes come into a collection from an object which is donated or acquired. For example, if a moldy book, for example, is brought in from outside and the conditions are right, that mold can spread to the rest of the collection. So the majority of the fungi that grow on the surface of heritage objects are conidial fungi. The most successful of the conidial fungi come from the order Eurotials. They're commonly found on archival, library, and museum collections, and they are also food contaminants. However, this order also produces antibiotics, for example, penicillin, as well as the immunosuppressant cyclosporine. Cyclosporine is used to help people who have had organ transplants by preventing the rejection of the donated organs. And it's also used for rheumatoid arthritis. So while we don't want them anywhere near our food or in our collections, molds do have their place in the world, and we should be glad that they exist, however unpleasant they may make our jobs in conservation and preservation. I've uploaded a brief glossary of mold-related terminology with a little bit about the stages of mold germination. Mold reproduction is incredibly complex, so I'll just briefly talk about the way mold reproduces. Mold reproduction and germination can vary depending upon mold species. The mold that tends to plague heritage collections reproduces through the following pretty simplified description. So a conidium, which is a spore produced by asexual reproduction, germinates and produces a vegetative stage in which hundreds of new conidia are produced. Mold hyphae, and that's the fuzzy hair-like stuff that you see on mold growth, disseminates large numbers of conidia, which then become airborne and land on new surfaces. So if the conditions are right, which we will talk about in just a bit, the spores will germinate, more hyphae will then sprout, which produces more spore sacs that will burst and produce even more spores. So that's a little bit about the reproductive cycle of mold. A mass of hyphae is called mycelium, and this mass is what you're looking at when you see a moldy spot on bread or cheese. It's quite a bit of hyphae altogether. So as I mentioned, this is a very simplified explanation. If you want to really get waist deep into the world of fungal reproduction, I highly recommend a book called Fungal Facts, Solving Fungal Problems in Heritage Collections by Mary Lou Florian. It's currently the go-to guide for understanding mold in library, archive, and museum collections. And although it's very dense, it has an incredible amount of helpful information. And I'll be putting up a link to that just a bit later. So one of the reasons we are so concerned with mold growth in collections is that mold are attracted to many of the materials that make up the objects in our archives, museums, and libraries. So this includes starches, which are found in adhesives, sizings, and cloth, proteins, including leather, parchment, gelatin, animal glues, and photographic emulsions, cellulose, which is part of wood furniture, objects, and frames, as well as paper and books. Mold also grows on some of the everyday debris which exists in any collection. This includes skin cells, clothing fibers, external dirt, and oily secretions such as fingerprints, as well as industrial pollution. Mold causes harm to archival and library materials by landing on a substrate, for example, book or your paper support, and begins to digest the material components. Mold secretes hydrolytic enzymes in order to break down the substrate into simpler substances, which can then be absorbed by the hyphae. The resulting degradation weakens materials. This makes them susceptible to further damage, further physical damage if they're knocked or dropped. And it also means that they can absorb water more readily, so they become much more sensitive to humidity, which produces a vicious cycle. Some molds also contain color substances that can cause staining, even after the mold itself is removed from the object. The color of the powdery stuff, the conidia, does not usually cause staining. It's the pigments which are excreted by the hyphae of the fungus that penetrates the surface of heritage objects and causes the colored spot. So mold will always be in our collections. It's in the air around us. It's always here. What we are concerned about is preventing the mold spores, which are floating around at this very moment, from becoming active and beginning to damage our collections. In order to know how to control the activation and growth of mold, we have to know what it likes. Mold has fairly basic requirements to become active, and two of the most important factors are, one, the availability of an organic substrate, so that's your heritage collection, that's your parchment or your book, and two is a source of moisture. Some of the other factors that affect the availability of mold to grow and thrive are temperature, air circulation, pH, availability of nutrients, and light exposure. And we'll talk about each of those in turn. The availability of moisture is incredibly important for mold to grow and flourish. Mold requires a moisture source to grow, to produce enzymes that break down the substrate it lands on in order to obtain nutrients, and also requires moisture in order to reproduce. Often when we talk about moisture levels in heritage collections, we think about relative humidity, and that's usually what we're referring to. High relative humidity is a very important factor to encourage mold growth, but the moisture content of the substrate the mold is growing on is also an important factor. Excuse me. This can help explain why two different types of material in the same environment can have different outcomes. One can become moldy while the other doesn't. You know, if you've ever had moldy fruit in your refrigerator, but other things which are nearby don't become moldy, this can kind of explain that a little bit. So for fungal decomposition of a substrate to occur, the moisture content of that substrate must be at least 20%. Relative humidity above 70% also increases the likelihood of mold growth, and at the same time, the mold will thrive off of the moisture content of the substrate that it's landed on. Some sources of moisture include high relative humidity in the immediate environment, poor air circulation, which can result in pockets of elevated relative humidity within a room which otherwise seems to be pretty dry. Usually the highest relative humidity in a room is right next to the coldest surface, including windows, near the floor, etc. This coldest surface will usually be the location where condensation begins to form. Water from a flood or as a result of an activated fire suppression system is also a common source of moisture. And unfortunately, water from aqueous conservation treatments, so those are conservation treatments involving water, can also be sources of moisture for mold. Most mold will grow at temperatures between 59 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. However, mold growth can occur between 40 degrees Fahrenheit to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature that mold prefers, and I know I'm kind of making mold sound like a person, but it can vary based on other factors, but generally is around 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Mold can lie dormant at sub-zero temperatures, and that's why we recommend freezing as part of one course of action for dealing with a mold outbreak. However, there is a misconception that freezing always kills mold spores. Freezing essentially causes mold to be deactivated so that it can then be removed through methods that we will discuss later. Activated or germinating conidia can be killed by freezing or extremes in temperature. However, deactivated conidia becomes dormant under the same conditions. Hydrated conidia and living hyphae can also be killed by freezing. And mold is less tolerant of rapidly fluctuating below freezing and above freezing temperatures. But we will talk about this just a bit more when we get to that section. Air movement is very important, not only for regulating pockets of high relative humidity in a space. Air circulation increases the evaporation and drying of moisture. All things being equal, good ventilation and air circulation can mean the difference between a mold bloom occurring on an object or not. pH of 6 is optimum for most of the mold species that we deal with in our heritage collections. So this means that mold prefer a substrate which is just slightly acidic. A pH of 7 is neutral, so a pH of 6 just crosses into acidic territory, and that's what mold prefers. Mold gains the nutrients it needs to grow and thrive from the substrates it lands on, which is, of course, what causes damage. Mold produces enzymes which break down archival and library materials to obtain nutrients such as carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, potassium, magnesium, iron, zinc, copper, manganese, and sometimes calcium. This process is what weakens and damages the surface of collections materials. Mold responses to light vary depending upon the species. Some mold is diurnal, meaning growth accelerates in the dark and slows when the mold is actually exposed to light, which creates the concentric circle growth patterns you sometimes see on mold and can see in this picture here. Other molds actually use light to aid spore production, so it really depends on the species of mold that you're dealing with. Just as an aside here, the photo of mold that's on the screen is actually the ceiling of a house in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. So just to quickly sum up what we've discussed so far, in general, the higher the relative humidity, the more readily mold will grow. High temperatures, stagnant air, storage spaces which are not environmentally controlled properly all contribute to mold growth. To keep mold spores dormant, ideally temperatures should be kept below 70 Fahrenheit, and relative humidity should be kept at 60% or below. Really, you want to keep the temperature and the relative humidity as low as possible. And good housekeeping can help remove the dirt and debris, which may serve as food sources for the mold. So now that we know what mold is and the factors which help and hinder its growth, we can move on to assessing mold in your archival, library, and museum collections. Active mold is the stuff that we really worry about, and heritage materials with a mold infestation can't be properly cleaned without making the mold inactive. You'll recognize active mold by the fact that it's often furry or fuzzy. If you brush it with a soft brush, it will appear to smear, and it spreads rapidly. Inactive mold looks powdery and dry, and it's easily brushed from the surface it's on without smearing. Sometimes, though, especially if you're feeling a bit panicked about the situation, if it's your first mold outbreak, it can be hard to tell. So if you're very unsure, assume it is active just to be safe. Oh, and let me repeat those temperatures. So to keep mold spores dormant, ideally temperatures should be kept below 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and relative humidity should be kept at 60% or below. But again, the lower you can keep the relative humidity and the temperature, the better. So here are some examples of active mold on collections materials. On the left side is a book covered with that fuzzy, furry active mold. This is a case where it's very easy to tell that the book is moldy and that it's active mold. So it's really fuzzy, really furry, you can't really mistake it. On the right is a moldy color slide, and the web-like strands that you see in this picture are networks of hyphae, which radiate out of the growth center, and those are what help to bring nutrients in to feed the mold. Some mold appears as splotchy discoloration, as dark patches, which you can see in the gutter of the ledger on the left side of the screen. Sorry, the looks like the caption moved over. But on the right is a cellulose acetate negative, which exhibits very distinct sites of circular growth. So it could be either. And just as an aside, also, cellulose acetate film is very prone to mold growth because it's cellulose and it's it also often has a gelatin layer, so it's both protein and cellulose. Pretty much any material in your collection has a potential for mold growth. So this is a magnified photograph of a basket on the left side, and you can see the spores very clearly in this picture. Mold which spreads in a closed book, as on the right side, can cause staining which looks like a Rorschach blot. So if mold growth occurs and the book is closed, you'll sort of see that almost like when you cut a snowflake out, or as I mentioned, the Rorschach test. Also, you can kind of see areas where holes have occurred at the same spot on both pages, and that's from mold growing with the book closed. Someone's asked if the mold looks like photoset. It's not just for the black mold. It applies to all mold. And actually, black mold, as we know it, what grows in our bathrooms, for example, and that actually is a different species than what grows in our heritage collections, which is good. Although both can exist, it tends to be on buildings, things like that more often. So there are some things which aren't mold, but can still give you a good scare by looking a whole lot like mold. And one of those is foxing, which is that reddish-brown mold-like staining you see on old paper. It most likely develops from contaminants introduced while the paper was being made. And foxing has a variety of potential causes. It may be fungal in nature. There's some research that suggests that it's microfungus. It's also due to metallic contaminants, things like that. But it is not mold. It's not the heritage mold that we worry about. One way to tell is that the staining is actually embedded in the paper and it does not have a surface texture. It's flat. And it can't be brushed away or shifted away with a soft brush. So while it may be unsightly, it is not the mold that we are worried about, in this case anyway. Dust can look a whole lot like furry, fluffy mold as well. And this is a case where you want to look at the patterns the dust follows. Mold tends to be more selective than dust in that it may follow moisture stains or fingerprints in the paper. Dust will generally appear as a uniform coating. It's worth noting, though, that mold can often be mixed with dust. That's very common. And unfortunately, dust, the things that are in dust, can serve as a good food source for mold. Dirt can also resemble mold, but its distribution patterns are different. So be suspicious of uneven coatings of dirt and look for those thread-like hyphae under raking light, which is light from the side. Dirt has distinct grainy particles. Mold doesn't have those distinct particles. But unfortunately, again, dirt and mold can and often do cohabitate in the same space. So that's another reason why we emphasize good housekeeping practices. And yes, mold can be any color of the rainbow, which is pretty special. So tide lines or tide marks, and again, sorry about this slide, I'm just having a formatting issue here, can sometimes appear to be mold. In case anyone listening doesn't know what tide lines or tide marks are, they're discolored areas which appear when a material, for example, paper or textiles, is exposed to moisture or high relative humidity or gets wet. And the subsequent migration of dyes, of dirt, optical brighteners, or degradation products creates an area which tends to be lighter in the center and darker at the edges. And I'm sure everyone who works with collections has seen this. But tide lines are not going to move if you sweep them with a soft brush. They're part of the paper surface. They're flat as well. They're not likely to be fuzzy. However, mold growth patterns do often follow tide lines because they're areas which were exposed to moisture, which mold likes. So if your tide line is furry, or it appears to also have some sort of particulate matter or anything that may resemble mold growth, you may also have mold growth along with the tide line or tide mark. Once you've determined that you do in fact have a mold outbreak, the response and recovery process should commence as soon as possible, but only after taking the time and care to make sure that health and safety procedures are followed very carefully. Some people are naturally very sensitive to mold and will know this already from past experience. Those people should not go anywhere near a mold outbreak for obvious reasons. However, mold sensitivities can actually develop very suddenly. in people who have not experienced them in the past. And it can cause severe complications, including allergic reactions, asthma attacks, and inflammatory reactions in the short term. To be honest, long-term effects of exposure to mold are still not fully understood, and that's something that's being researched. People who've been through natural disasters can sometimes display delayed after effects years after mold exposure, including effects on the central nervous system, which I'm not telling you this to scare you, but to remind you why it's really best to be prepared and protected in advance. If you do not feel that you can handle being involved in a mold recovery operation for health reasons, that is a fair choice. People who have compromised immune systems or immune disorders should not enter a mold-infested area. People with diabetes or asthma, people who are taking steroids for steroid therapy, and pregnant women should also not be involved in a mold recovery operation. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, recommends levels of protection based on the size of the mold outbreak that you're dealing with. When in doubt, of course, you always want to use more protection rather than less. But minimum protection is recommended for a mold outbreak covering a surface area of 10 square feet or less. This includes an N95 respirator, nitrile or other disposable gloves, and safety goggles, or another form of eye protection. Limited protection is recommended for a mold outbreak covering a surface area of 10 to 100 square feet or less. This includes an N95 respirator or half-face respirator with HEPA filter, disposable coveralls, gloves, and eye protection. And finally, full protection is recommended for a mold outbreak covering a surface area of 100 square feet or more. This includes gloves, disposable full body covering such as a Tyvek suit, headgear, shoe covers, and a full face respirator with a HEPA filter. Just in case anyone attending this webinar doesn't know what a HEPA filter is, it's a high efficiency particulate filter that removes 97 to 99.97% of particles down to 0.3 microns in size. I do want to emphasize that if you're dealing with a mold outbreak that is covering a very large surface area, you most likely will need and will want to get the professionals involved. So if it gets to the point where full protection is needed, you probably need a mold remediation firm involved. We'll talk about that in a bit. Here are two examples of the respirators that you might wear. On the left, you've got an N95 particulate respirator, which is disposable. And on the right, you have a half-face respirator with P100 cartridges. And those cartridges are disposable as well. P refers to particulate matter, while the number refers to the approximate percentage of particles that are filtered out. So a properly fitted respirator with P100 filter cartridges will filter out 99.9% of particles, 0.3 microns or larger. The N in N95 refers to the fact that that filter is not oil resistant, so that respirator is not oil resistant, and that it filters out 95% of particles, 0.3 microns or larger. I should also mention that it's very important to get a half-face or full-face respirator properly fit tested. If you do get one and it's not been fit tested, it's not going to do the job to the level that you would expect. Industrial hygienists in your area can assist you with this, and they can also direct you to someone who's trained with respirator fit testing. The American Institute of Conservation also can provide you with information on getting respirators fit tested. Once you've been fit tested for a respirator, you should ideally have the fit checked every 12 months to ensure that it's functioning as efficiently as possible. In terms of cover-up PPE, you want to look for safety goggles that are not ventilated, so you don't want those mold spores getting into the goggles. Full-body Tyvek suits are necessary for very large active mold outbreaks or mold outbreaks in areas which may have other issues such as raw sewage or toxic or dangerous substances. So, for example, after a natural disaster. You can get Tyvek suits that are extra fancy and have attached shoe covers and full-length rubber gloves if necessary. But rubber or nitrile gloves are recommended anytime you come into contact with moldy material no matter how large or small an outbreak is. If you've had any disaster preparedness training, you know that the first thing you need to do upon discovering an emergency situation is to stabilize the area. So the following stabilizing techniques are recommended for discovering a mold outbreak. Excuse me. Step one is to locate the source of moisture or humidity. It could be a number of things. It could be a hole in the roof, it could be a leaky pipe, a broken window, a flooded basement. It could be all of those things if your institution has just experienced a natural disaster. It's common for a mold outbreak to be triggered by an HVAC system issue or an HVAC system leak, which is very problematic. You may find a very small mold outbreak on a shelf of books on or near an exterior wall, which is close to the floor, as a result of condensation. Whatever the moisture source is, you want to identify it so that it can be corrected as soon as possible. In a water emergency, you have roughly 24 to 48 hours before mold begins to grow. So once you've identified the source of moisture, you want to address it as soon as possible. If your institution has an HVAC system which can dehumidify the air, and you've confirmed that it is not a source of mold contamination and has not been contaminated itself, then you want to turn that on, unless it is a thermostatically controlled or fan coil system. In that case, that can make things worse. Pardon me. So if you don't have an HVAC system, or if your HVAC system appears to be the source of mold contamination, use what you've got. Open windows to get air circulating, turn on fans at low speed, put dehumidifiers in the space. And if you are trying to circulate air, it's okay just to use a regular fan. And of course, you don't want to point any fans directly at affected materials because you don't want to send those mold spores airborne. But you do want to get air circulation, and a fan is a quick and easy way to begin that process. The third step after addressing the humidity or moisture source is to isolate affected materials. Unaffected items can be placed in plastic bags. Disposable material, anything that can be thrown away, should be packed in polyethylene bags, sealed, and disposed of properly. In a smaller outbreak, for example, if you have just a few moldy items that need to be treated, you can, pardon me, sorry. You can put those into plastic bags to transfer to a treatment area. Although you do want to avoid leaving moldy objects in a plastic bag for too long, because you're essentially creating a microclimate in there, and that will sort of speed up mold growth. If it's a very large outbreak, avoid moving affected materials out of the area and treat in situ if possible. Of course, if it's a very large outbreak, your best course of action is to quarantine the area and get professional help. Close the doors, hang plastic sheeting, and reduce air circulation from the affected area to other parts of the building to avoid mold spreading. Once you've stabilized the area, you can begin the process of inactivating and cleaning the mold, which we'll talk about now. I know that I keep saying this, but there are many occasions when you really do need to get an outside contractor involved. If you have a medium to large scale outbreak, it's very difficult to manage yourself unless you have a very large staff, a large trained staff, I should say. Toxic strains of mold, mold combined with hazardous substances, present situations that you really also don't want to deal with yourself. In that case, it's imperative that you get an outside mold remediation company involved. They're trained, they have equipment, knowledge, and experience to deal with what can become a very dangerous situation. If you suspect that the HVAC system and building are also moldy, the problem is very likely serious. Not that it isn't serious other times, but in that case, it's really important to get professional remediators involved. Anything that's very delicate or rare or valuable in your collection, that should be taken for conservation treatment. So trying to inactivate and clean mold on very important, very valuable, very rare or special materials can inadvertently weaken or destroy these things. And finally, if you're just completely overwhelmed and you don't have the staff or resources to deal with it institutionally, you don't have the manpower, the hands to actually deal with it, Getting contractors on site will help to manage the situation. If you have a fairly small outbreak, you can deal with it in-house. First, you want to inactivate active mold growth. So you don't want to try to clean active mold because you will just end up embedding it deeper into the paper fibers, for example, and spreading active mold spores to other areas. Once the mold is inactive, you can begin the process of cleaning the items, which we will talk about in just a bit. The site of the outbreak must also be thoroughly cleaned. So surfaces, floors, any area that you suspect has come into contact with active mold needs to be thoroughly cleaned. Stabilizing and cleaning moldy materials is only half the battle, because if you return clean materials to an environment which is conducive to mold growth, you will very quickly end up with exactly the same problem. The issues causing the initial outbreak have to be addressed properly. And the environment must be very carefully controlled and monitored. So we'll talk about each of these steps in more detail as we go along. One important thing to note, the following procedures may inactivate mold growth. However, dormant mold spores will remain viable. So this means that given the right environmental circumstances, mold spores will become active again. This is why it's so important to ensure that you aren't returning formerly moldy objects to a mold-friendly environment. So I do want to emphasize that the things I'm going to talk about don't kill mold, they inactivate it. So it's still there. If you do reintroduce moisture or high relative humidity, for example, it can become problematic. One of the most common ways to inactivate mold is to freeze moldy material. So if mold has resulted from a water emergency, freezing buys you time while you figure out what your next step is. It's a solution when you have a small amount of moldy material. If you have a lot, you will need to get a remediation firm involved. Although this is fairly convenient, not all materials respond well to being frozen, and that includes some photographic materials such as glass plates and case negatives. Paintings with thick layers of paint or varnish sometimes do not respond well to freezing. Anything that has like a layered structure, a varnished mat, for example, does not respond well to freezing. So it's best to evaluate everything on a case-by-case basis. It's also important to properly wrap moldy materials to protect them from becoming damp when you freeze them. Just a quick note, fungicides and fungostats are not recommended for collections anymore, generally speaking. Although for extremely toxic mold species, outside professionals may use these for HVAC systems and ductwork. However, they've not been tested for long-term effects. And it's, it is below 20 degrees Fahrenheit, apologies for that minus 20 I have there. Although conservators will always tell you to avoid UV light on your objects, in the case of a mold outbreak, it can sometimes become the lesser evil. So either the sun or a UV lamp can be a good source of UV levels necessary to inactivate and dry mold so that it can then be removed. Because UV light can be very damaging to paper and photographic materials, it's recommended that exposure time is limited to less than 30 minutes. Desiccant drying is a service offered by vendors who pump moist or human hair out of the affected area and reintroduce dry air into the space. This is a very good solution for dehydrating in situ so that it can be removed, particularly when the outbreak is fairly large. It is expensive. It may not be feasible for every institution or even most institutions, but it's effective, especially when you've got a very large outbreak in a particular easily contained area. Air drying is one way to inactivate mold and materials which have gotten wet. However, it's really only for damp materials. It's not for wet or soaked objects. It's good for small outbreaks and for materials which cannot be frozen or desiccated. However, you do have a limited window in which to dry materials before mold becomes an issue, and that's approximately 24 to 48 hours. If you've ever been through a water emergency or a natural disaster, a burst pipe in your institution, you'll know that air drying takes a great deal of space, time, and manpower, and it's an exhausting process. However, in the case of a small outbreak on damp objects, or if you do have the staff to handle this, this is a viable option. So once you've inactivated the mold, the next step is cleaning the inactive mold spores off of your material. You want to make sure that you're cleaning inactive mold spores. Again, just a reminder, active mold will smear, it will possibly become further embedded in your object, and it can spread. You also do not want to clean mold, even inactive mold, so any mold, off of pastels, charcoal drawings, corroded iron gall ink, flaking paint, flaking photographic emulsions, anything which is friable, delicate, easily damaged, rare, or valuable. That is a job for a conservator. Mold removal should be done either outdoors or indoors using a fume hood with a mold trapping filter. It's very important that you don't try to clean mold inside because you will most likely inadvertently spread it. One of the most reliable ways to remove inactivated mold is with a vacuum with a HEPA filter. Any vacuum used for mold cleanup should not be a normal household vacuum. Aside from causing cross-contamination, a household vacuum will expel mold spores after vacuuming them. HEPA vacuums and vacuums with water bath filters must be used so that mold spores and other matter can be contained and disposed of. For vacuuming mold off of objects, a micro toolkit is available which has tiny, precise little parts for targeting specific areas. And a vacuum aspirator is another tool that's often used. Because you don't want to directly vacuum a drawing on paper, for example, one suggestion is to vacuum through a fiberglass filter so that you don't cause damage, creases, or tears. Another option is to use a soft brush to gently dislodge mold from the paper surface, directing it toward a small vacuum nozzle so that it can be picked up and removed. Any vacuuming should be done, again, outside or under a fume hood with a mold filter. If you're worried that an object is too fragile to be vacuumed, it's always best to consult a conservator. And there's a question about wiping with alcohol. You can use an ethanol and water mixture, which I'll talk about in just a bit, to wipe down the surfaces that the mold contaminated object is on. You don't really want to wipe things with mold, any kind of archival materials, museum materials, things like that. You don't really want to wipe them. Sometimes you can spray an ethanol and water spray onto the material, provided it isn't too moisture sensitive, and that can be used to inactivate mold spores. But that's something that's generally best done by a conservator, I'd say. A final method is to use a soot sponge or a chemical sponge or a dry cleaning sponge. It has lots of different names. It's that sponge on the left side there to remove the mold particles once they've been inactivated. And on the right, you see a vacuum attachment with a brush that can be used as well. And the person on the left side is doing a great job, I'm sure, but you do want to wear your gloves. Just a little note there. So once you've removed mold from the objects by inactivating it and either vacuuming it or using another method, you will have to clean surfaces in the affected area which may be harboring mold spores. So this includes floors, work surfaces, shelves, countertops, anything which may have come into contact with moldy materials. So you'll want to vacuum these surfaces with a HEPA vacuum to start to remove any residual mold, any of the fuzzy stuff. Non-porous surfaces should be wiped with water or a water mixture. So one of the most common solutions is to use 40% isopropyl alcohol, which is also known as rubbing alcohol, by volume in water. It's very easy to get rubbing alcohol. It's a quick solution. And you want to make sure that all surfaces have a chance to dry completely before returning objects to these spaces. Mitigating future risk is just as important as any initial remediation measures that you undertake. Going through the effort, time, and cost to remove mold from your collections is pointless if they are then put back into environmental conditions, which will cause the same mold growth and degradation to occur. Mitigating the risk of a future mold outbreak requires a coordinated effort from the entire institution, planning and policy, establishing a segregated or quarantine area, consistent HVAC and building maintenance, proper storage, regular housekeeping, and maintaining appropriate environmental parameters are all very important parts of preventing the reoccurrence of a mold outbreak in collections. Establishing the necessary policies to control risk is very important. These policies include a solid emergency preparedness and response plan, which has provisions for dealing with fire, water, and other natural disasters, as well as a mold recovery plan. Oh, no sound again?
Yeah.
Can anyone hear me? Or we might be having a, oh, someone's got sound, that's good. All right. Okay, all right, back to it. So you do want to have procedures in place at your institution for handling an incoming object suspected of a mold infestation. You do want to have a segregation and quarantine plan also for dealing with pest infestations. So it's really important for many reasons to have that in place before you have some kind of infestation. Maintenance and housekeeping plans will support a regular schedule of cleaning, inspecting, and building maintenance. And environmental monitoring plans will help direct a targeted approach to ensuring that the environment and areas collections are exhibited or stored are carefully monitored so the environment is kept within the recommended parameters to prohibit mold growth or activation. Regular inspection and cleaning of the HVAC system, including frequent changing of filters, is very necessary to prevent and avoid mold occurring in a system which can possibly distribute it throughout a building. It's important to perform regular maintenance and, as basic as it is, checking of trouble areas to ensure that they do not develop into a larger issue. You also want to ensure good air circulation throughout the building and avoid pockets of stagnant air where mold can begin to grow. So if you've got an area of your storage room, for example, that you know has a tendency to form condensation against an exterior wall, maybe close to the floor, just regular daily checking of that area is so important to avoiding a major mold outbreak. Regular dusting, keeping collections materials in boxes and enclosures when possible, vacuuming floors instead of just sweeping are all fairly simple tasks which will make a huge difference in keeping your collections mold-free. Another important aspect of regular housekeeping is that it allows you to spend time checking on areas and materials you might otherwise not get a chance to examine. And of course, keeping collections areas free of food, drink, and plants is important, as these things can also contribute to a mold outbreak. One of the most crucial steps to avoiding another mold outbreak is to control and monitor the environment. So ideally, you want to keep humidity below 55% and temperature below 70 degrees Fahrenheit to ensure that mold is not reactivated. In order to make sure that you are carrying out an effective program of environmental control, you must regularly monitor and record data, preferably by using an independent data logger. So even if you've got a great HVAC system which monitors and records temperature and relative humidity itself, or maybe is linked to a computer program that records temperature and relative humidity, it's really important to have a separate independent device to monitor the environment. An HVAC system with data is great, but a data logger will help you confirm that this data is actually correct, and it will also help you catch HVAC failures or inconsistencies. Data loggers are also good at helping you to monitor pockets of storage which you know are problematic. So for example, if you've had a mold outbreak in a specific area of storage and you aren't sure why as you're getting an appropriate environmental reading for the rest of the storage room, installing a data logger in the space and monitoring the data will let you know if you're dealing with stagnant air, condensation, or some other issue which makes the environment conducive to mold growth. And finally, proper storage is very important. Avoiding storing collections in damp basements when possible, storing collections at least 4 to 6 inches off the floor, avoiding storage in areas with past leaks or poorly insulated exterior walls. Anywhere with a tendency which has a tendency to be the site of condensation is going to be problematic for your collections. If your institution has compact shelving, you may want to occasionally leave gaps in the shelving to prevent the formation of pockets of stagnant air and to let air circulate in these spaces. So we are almost done. I just want to point you towards some of the resources that I've uploaded with this webinar. One is the CCAHA Guide to Managing a Mold Invasion, NEDCC's Guide to the Emergency Salvage of Moldy Books and Paper, NHR's Post-Flood Health and Safety Sheet, a vacuum fact sheet for choosing and using a vacuum in heritage collections, and a glossary of basic mold terminology. So 3 additional resources I'd like to point you to include the EPA's Guide to Mold, which is the Environmental Protection Agency's guide. It's very good. Also, the American Institute for Conservation, AIC's Find a Conservator tool, which is really great. It's a great way to start if you don't know a conservator, if you need someone to evaluate your collections after a mold outbreak. It allows you to enter parameters for area, type of material being treated, etc. Leather can be exposed to UV light. It is something that you would want to dry it out slowly before exposing it to UV light because you wouldn't want it to crack. I tend to think if you have a leather object, it's best to have a conservator evaluate it, but if you've got quite a few books which need to be dried and demolded, for lack of a better word, it is the lesser of the evils, so you can expose leather to UV light in an extreme situation. And finally, I do very much recommend Fungal Facts, Solving Fungal Problems in Heritage Collections by Mary Lou Florian. It's an incredibly comprehensive look at mold in heritage collections. It's a great book to have on hand, particularly if you do have a collection which has experienced mold in the past or is prone to mold outbreaks. And it's also a good way to make sure that people don't sit next to you on public transport if you bring it to read. Just a quick note, Belfour and Polygon are 2 of the most well-known vendors that carry out mold remediation and document recovery services. They are by no means the only ones, though. There are several others. I do suggest making contact with the mold remediation vendor well in advance of a disaster or mold outbreak. And as part of writing a disaster preparedness and response plan, it's always better to know what you need to do well in advance of a situation where you might be panicky. So that's my 2 cents about that. So at this point, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. We are going to have workshops in the autumn on mold prevention, mold remediation, and those will be held in 5 cities around New York State. So if you are interested in learning more about mold in collections, how to take care of mold in your collections, things like that, those will be held in October and November. And we'll probably announce those dates and those sites this month. So just something to keep an eye out for. And they're, of course, free of charge, as all of Dipsy's workshops are. So are there any other questions? And I apologize for the sound and computer issues that we've had today. Any last questions anybody might have? Any surprise mold questions? Well, if you do think of questions and you would like to get in contact with us at any point, there are many ways that you can do so. We also encourage you to check out our very entertaining and informative social media presence, which is courtesy of Communications Assistant Jason Henn. If you have questions for me in particular, like Gillian, what is your favorite mold species? Or if a mold-related query pops into your head in the middle of the night, you can also email me directly at gmarcus, that's gmarcus@tipsy.org. Oh, we got one question. Can you create a hood versus buying one? And I'm guessing that refers to a fume hood. A fume hood is a very difficult thing to make. I would generally suggest that you buy one, unless you've got someone who is an engineer on your staff and who can sort of rig something up. I would recommend buying a fume hood or an elephant trunk, something like that. They're pretty hard to make yourself. But that's a very good question. Are there any other questions? You can use extreme heat to deactivate mold on some objects. It's pretty problematic for the type of materials that are generally in collections. But it is a possibility for some things. Usually you go through other methods first before you turn to extreme heat, just because it's so damaging. And there's a question about storing collections in an unheated room in winter. Is that conducive to mold? Actually, at that point, in winter, you are dealing with colder temperatures, which is great. Sometimes the relative humidity can do weird things, but you're generally a little bit safer at that point than you are in the summertime, for example. How to get rid of tide lines? Getting rid of tide lines would be a webinar in itself. They're very difficult, and they're generally best treated by a conservator, unfortunately, because sometimes trying to treat tide lines makes more tide lines and makes them worse. So I wish I had a quick answer for that, but the best way to get rid of tide lines is to call a conservator. Any questions? Questions about mold? And we will have this up online, hopefully with a complete recording without dropped areas, and we will have the slides up as well as along with the documents that I'm uploading. Oh, one last question: does foxing spread? Foxing can appear to spread in that it can become worse over time, but it doesn't necessarily spread from one object to another. You don't really want an object with foxing to immediately touch another object, just because you're dealing with some metallic issues and some fungal issues, but yeah, it won't jump from one book to another, for example, which is good news for everyone. All right, thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and we will have this information for you